The main question here, of course, is what helps to recover. And here one can take two approaches. One approach is looking at activities. So the question, what are people doing? And that's also how we started this kind of research. And for instance, our findings and also that of other groups show that, for instance, sport and exercise activities are very helpful for recovery. Also, social activities help under certain circumstances. But when we did this research on the activities, we thought, is it really the question, what are people doing? Or is it more important to look at the underlying mechanisms that might be more important for recovery to occur? So what is it in psychological terms that helps people to recover? And so we focused during the past years really on something what we call recovery experiences. So what are people experiencing when they are off the job and how this helps to recover? And we looked at this within day and also longitudinally. And in the presentation today, I will focus on psychological detachment from work during non-work time, of course, as a recovery experience. So the question is, how do people mentally detach from work? That's the question which is most important for recovery to occur. That brings me to the task of describing what is psychological detachment. It was coined by Etzion and colleagues as an individual sense of being away from the work situation, and it means to refrain from job activities during off-job hours, and it's not only not working, but it's also to refrain from job-related thoughts during this after work hours. So that's what people often describe as switching off, getting a mental break, so not thinking about work, but immersing oneself into another world, so to say. A brief words about assessment. So we developed a self-report measure, very brief, 4 items. We have versions in various languages, and we have a general measure that can be adopted to day-specific assessments for daily research and has, of course, good internal consistency. And what's also important, that we can differentiate it from other recovery concepts, for instance, from relaxation. And that holds also for the various language versions. So detachment from work is something different than relaxation. Of course, it's positively correlated, but that's not the same. Now let's look at empirical findings on detachment and well-being. What do we know? First of all, there are quite some cross-sectional studies that show that people who detach from work during their non-work time have a lower level of emotional exhaustion, they have a lower need for recovery, and they have a higher life satisfaction. That's nice, but of course, you all know cross-sectional data don't tell so much. So it's important to go into more detail and to look at the between-person level longitudinally. So does detachment predict well-being over time? And also later I will show within-person studies. So let's look at a longitudinal study that looked at detachment and emotional exhaustion. And we had a time lag of 1 year. And our sample were people working with disabled persons, so psychologists, social workers, and these kinds of jobs, predominantly women. The kind of data we assessed, survey data, we assessed job demands, so time pressure, for instance, that are known to predict emotional exhaustion over time, emotional dissonance, so the feeling of how one has to act openly in terms of emotions do not match to the inner feelings, which is an important stressor in this kind of work. Then we had the time one data of psychological detachment and a whole range of control variables, and our outcome measure was emotional exhaustion 1 year later. The findings, we'll briefly walk through it. Control variables, mainly non-significant. Emotional exhaustion at time 1, a very strong predictor of emotional exhaustion at time 2. So that's the high stability of emotional exhaustion. People who were exhausted in the first year were also tended to be exhausted in the second year. So, and that means this is controlled for. Then job demands predict an increase in emotional exhaustion. That's not new. There are other studies that have shown it, but here it's important to note this because this tells us that our sample probably is a very regular, normal sample, nothing very special going on there. Emotional dissonance and job control do not add anything beyond already the initial level of emotional exhaustion. And now the most important question, of course, is what does psychological detachment? Can this predict emotional exhaustion 1 year later? And it can. So the higher the level of psychological detachment during non-work time, the lower the level of emotional exhaustion 1 year later. So people who succeeded in detaching tended to reduce their level of emotional exhaustion, and those who did not detach tended to increase their level of emotional exhaustion. So to summarize this study, we have this increase in emotional exhaustion. We have used a broad range of control variables. We also tested for reverse causation and did not find the reverse causation with this 1 year time lag. And interestingly and nicely, there's another study by Verena Hahn and her colleagues, and they looked at psychological detachment from work during the weekend, so a much shorter time span, and they found a reduction in negative affect and fatigue from pre-weekend to post-weekend in those people who detached very well. So a nice replication or illustration that works also in other time lags. So weekends, when people detached well, they were less fatigued, had lower levels of negative affect after the weekend. So that's something we also should keep in mind when planning our weekends.